What happens when a lonely farmer buys not only a mare, but also a blind girl whom everyone has long forgotten? You won't believe how this decision will turn his life upside down in the most unexpected way. The bread was stale, so stale that the knife slid rather than cut. But Daniel pressed down with his palm and kept pushing, as if it weren't bread, but a stubborn memory that refused to go away. He threw a couple of pieces into a bowl, poured warm water over them, and stirred quietly. The mare, old, with white eyelashes and perpetually drooping ears, rose listlessly from her bedding. Watching her eat, he exhaled for the first time that day. Quietly, as if there was still someone who needed him. The kitchen smelled of dust and baked beets. Water bubbled in an old kettle. His wife's jacket hung on the wall. He had never taken it down, even though years had passed. The jacket had long since lost its scent, but every time he walked past it, he slowed down a little, as if someone were touching his shoulder. The morning was the same as all the others, gray and routine, like the gray clay under his feet. But on this day, he decided to go to the fair. Not for groceries, not for company. He avoided such things. It was just that the old mare could no longer pull the cart, and without her, he couldn't bring home firewood or potatoes from the field. He pulled on his worn jacket, adjusted the collar as he used to do before going to church, and went out. The smell of autumn and wet boards hung in the air. A gate creaked somewhere. A neighbor's dog barked, as always. But he walked on without looking back. There was no one there anyway. The fair was noisy. People were shouting, arguing, spitting in the mud. Some were selling baskets, others goose eggs, and some were selling horses. That was where he was headed. "Old but strong," said the seller, patting the bay horse on the side. "Not a beauty, of course, but she'll do the job." "I don't need her for show," Daniel muttered, and began to examine the hooves. He haggled quickly. The horse was indeed old, but calm and not nervous. He was about to pay when he noticed a cart behind the pen. A girl was sitting on the hay, curled up like a puppy. She was thin as a dried twig. Her hair was tangled. Her eyes were closed. And then he realized they weren't closed. They were empty. "What's this?" he asked hoarsely. She was with the horse. "Take her too," said the seller without looking. "Are you serious?" But no one laughed. An old woman standing nearby adjusted her headscarf and looked away. Someone turned away. Someone pretended to be busy with a rope. The girl didn't move. She was just breathing lightly. He stood there. His heart wasn't pounding. No. It was as if someone had touched an old wound that he no longer felt. And now it burned again. "You don't have any children?" someone in the crowd asked suddenly, mockingly. "Then take one that's ready-made." He turned around sharply, but the face from which the voice had come was already gone. When he climbed into the cart, the girl didn't flinch. She just kept her hands on her knees and waited. No fear, no questions, as if it wasn't the first time. He held out his handkerchief to her, not out of pity. He just couldn't do anything else. She didn't take it. So he put it down beside her. They set off. Strange faces flashed by, along with a hum, hay, and damp handkerchiefs. Behind them was noise. Ahead of them, silence. Long, heavy silence. At home, on the porch, his neighbor met him. "Why do you need another burden?" she said, looking not at the girl but at him. "Don't you have enough of your own?" He didn't answer. He just took the girl by the hand, carefully, as if afraid she would break, and led her into the house. And at that moment, he became truly afraid. Not because he now had one more mouth to feed, but because, for the first time in many years, someone had entered his home and hadn't left. She sat against the wall, right on the floor. Next to her was a cup of milk that had long since grown cold. The girl was silent, asking no questions, not moving. She didn't even seem to be breathing, just listening to the creaking ceiling, the dripping water from under the sink, and the sound of a man walking across the creaky floorboards in another room, not knowing what to say. Daniel placed a piece of bread in front of her and stepped back, as if he were feeding a wild bird that might fly away at the slightest movement. He didn't know how to be around people, let alone children, especially ones like her. Too quiet, too transparent, as if she hadn't been fed, but hidden away. "What's your name?" he exhaled without turning around. Silence. "I don't bite," he muttered. "Or are you afraid?" She didn't answer. He took his wife's old flannel shirt out of the closet. He folded it on the edge of a chair. He covered it with a blanket. Then he sat down by the stove, clasped his hands together, and lowered his chin. He sat there for a long time. He thought it was all pointless, that he shouldn't have bothered, that it was stupid. And then he heard, "Clara." Her voice was thin, like a crack in porcelain. She didn't turn her head or move. She just said one word and fell silent again. "Clara," he repeated. "Well, at least that's something." The next day, he took the mare out to graze. Clara stayed in the house. When he returned, he found her sitting on the floor in the hallway. She was clinging to the doorframe like a blind kitten looking for a crack in the fence. "I thought you had left," she said quietly. "Do I look like someone who leaves?" He snorted, realizing that he did. Very much so. The neighbor came again, with a jar of jam and a look on her face as if she were about to interrogate him. "Do you even realize what you're doing? It's not a calf. You can't sell it, you can't slaughter it, you can't fatten it up. You don't have a penny to your name," she grumbled, putting the jar on the table. "That girl, she's not just a troublemaker. She's, well, you know." "I know," he interrupted. "Do you have any apricot left?" "Are you joking, you old fool? What am I supposed to do, cry?" She sighed. Then she slowly sat down. "You've always been soft, Daniel. That's why they walk all over you. You don't know how to say no." He smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it hurt. It made his throat itch and his fingers tingle. "Maybe so," he said. "Or maybe I just remember what it's like when someone doesn't take your hand, but lets you go." She left silently. She left the jam. Clara didn't sleep that night. He could hear her breathing. Quiet, slightly irregular, as if she was afraid that if she fell asleep, she would wake up somewhere else. He didn't sleep either. He stared at the ceiling for a long time, counting the cracks. Then he got up, went over to the stove, and threw some wood on the fire. He glanced at his wife's jacket. It was still hanging there, and for the first time in many years, he thought, maybe it's hanging there for a reason. He didn't know what to do with this girl, what to say to her, how to explain that she wasn't a burden, a mistake, just a person, someone he couldn't leave behind. He was just beginning to understand that sometimes it's enough just to be there and not say anything. And sometimes that's not enough. We've reached a turning point. What happens next will change everything. You can't miss the ending of this story. Daniel's house was old, but sturdy. The walls were warped from age, but still standing. Just like him. The roof leaked over the shed, the floor creaked in the bedroom, and only rusty water came out of one tap. But the firewood was always stacked, the dishes were washed, and the tablecloth, though worn, was straight. No one slammed doors or interrupted. And that was his whole happiness, and all his loneliness. At first, Clara didn't seem to understand that it was possible to live without shouting. She shuddered at every creak and didn't touch the bread until she was asked. She walked around the house with her arms outstretched, as if afraid of bumping into someone's shoulder, fist, or back. She wore the same shirt every day. She slept with her legs tucked under her, on the edge of the bed, even when she was alone. He tried not to look, not to think. He just chopped wood, fed the animals, and repaired the fence. And in the evening, he put a plate in front of her. Sometimes with borscht, sometimes with porridge. He said briefly, "Eat." Then he walked away so she wouldn't feel like she was being tested. Several days passed, and then, at some point, she asked, "Why is everything so clean here?" He was surprised. For the first time, she didn't just say her name or thank him for the milk. She asked a question. "Because dirt is when no one needs you," he replied after a pause. She nodded, slowly, as if she needed to feel the phrase inside her rather than hear it. The neighbors stopped by more and more often. Some brought cabbage, others had questions. Some were just passing by, but they made sure to comment loudly. "He's lost his mind, the old man. Now he's taking in orphans." Madame Laurent, a local widow with a tongue longer than the village street, came by especially often. She looked at Clara as if she were a piece of damaged merchandise, appraisingly, as if trying her on for a display window. And then she said what should not have been said. She should go to the city. There are good shelters there. There are specialists. And what about you? You're old, deaf, alone. She's blind. What will she do here? Live, he replied, simply and quietly. But then he couldn't sleep for a long time that night. Daniel's son lived far away. He hadn't written for years. They hadn't spoken since his mother's funeral. He thought his father had given up too much. His father thought his son had become a stranger. Now there was silence, the kind that rings in your ears. Sometimes Daniel would go to the phone and just hold the receiver. He didn't call. He just held it, like you hold a heavy spoon over an empty plate, knowing there's nothing left to eat. Once, coming back from the field, he saw Clara sitting on the porch, running her fingers over a rough board. At first he thought she was lonely, but then he realized she was reading. Blind, with her fingers. Just like that. Without books, without letters. On the wood. As if the wood was all she had. Sometimes she spoke a little, about how she heard birds when she was a child, about her grandmother, who had tea with lemon, and was taken away on a cart and never returned, about how she learned to be silent because sometimes words hurt. "Who hit you?" he asked once. She lowered her head. "Everyone." He didn't ask any more questions. He just put a mug of warm milk in her hands and left. He started building a bigger pen. He put a bench in the garden. He dragged an old barrel out of the shed, cleaned it up, and put it next to the bench as a table. Then he sat Clara down next to it and said, "Look, that's a tree. Or, rather, touch it. It's an apple tree. It's as old as I am." "You mean it's old?" she asked, smiling for the first time. He laughed, really laughed, with his throat in his eyes. He hadn't laughed like that since the funeral. He even scared himself. One night she came out of her room and stood in the kitchen doorway. "Daniel?" He looked up. "Am I scaring you?" He stood up, walked over, took her hand, and said, "Nothing has scared me in a long time, and if it does, it's not you." She didn't smile. She just sat down next to him and asked, "Tell me what your life was like before me." And he began to tell her. Not everything. Not right away. But for the first time, he told someone who hadn't seen his face. And she heard his heart. The fair came to the village again. The same carts, the same faces. Everything was loud, meaty, noisy. Daniel wasn't going to go, but he had to replace a couple of boards on the roof. They had rotted, and the boards weren't going to fly to him. Then Clara suddenly said, "I can go with you. I'll sit in the cart and listen." He froze. It was the first time she had ever suggested leaving the house. Not for bread, not for milk, just to be close. "It's noisy there," he replied hoarsely. "Noise isn't scary," she shrugged. "It's scary when no one hears you. At least this way. They'll hear you." He didn't answer for a long time. Then he nodded, and she went with him. The market was crowded. Horses neighed. Children shouted. Old women chatted as if their words weighed a ton. Some haggled over pumpkins, others over boots. Clara sat in the shade of a cart. Her fingers clenched the edge of the bench as if it were the only thing holding her up. She didn't ask for anything. She just listened and waited for him to buy the boards. And then he appeared. The seller. The same one who had sold the mare. And Clara. "Oh, look how your little horse has settled in," he said with a laugh. "And the girl, is she still breathing?" Daniel pressed his lips together. He didn't like scandals. He always believed that silence was the best weapon. But now, this silence was like spitting on himself. "You said she was with the horse. What do you mean, yours?" "Well, how else? That's how we do things here. We give away what we don't need. You got lucky. 2 for the price of 1. They laughed. Not just him. The peasants nearby, the women, even the boys, watching furtively, as if it were funny. As if it were okay to laugh at someone being given a blind child like a moldy loaf of bread. "Go away," Daniel said quietly. "What? Are you offended? Did you think they'd thank you? Now they'll only remember you for taking someone else's grief as if it were your own cart. Go away before it's too late." The seller snorted and walked away. Clara sat in the cart. She didn't move. Only her hands were shaking. He could see it in her knuckles, in the way they were turning white. At home, she was silent. She didn't go to the table. She didn't take off her jacket. She just sat down by the window and turned her face to the wall, as if she were back in a cage, as if these people were the very door she had never left. "Clara," he called. "He was just a fool." She didn't answer. He approached her and sat down next to her. He wanted to take her hand, but couldn't bring himself to do it. "You're not with a horse. You're with a human being. Do you understand?" "What's the difference?" she replied quietly. "He's a person too, and everyone there was laughing. Not everyone. Everyone who heard, and kept quiet. And he understood she wasn't hurt because of him. She was hurt because she felt like an object again, because she had been discussed and passed around like a useless box. And again, no one stood up, not even him. Late in the evening, she went out onto the porch. She stood there, hugging herself. The air was damp and smelled of smoke and wet leaves. If you only knew what it's like to be given away. Not for debts, not for money. Just given away. Because you're inconvenient. Because you get in the way. He stood in the doorway, silent. "I thought it wasn't like that here. That it was different here. But it turns out it's just quieter." Those words pierced him more than any scream. She wasn't accusing him. She was just stating a fact. And he understood. This was the line. Either he would become someone who silently endured everything, or he would finally tell the truth, even if his voice trembled. He woke up before dawn, not because he had to, because he couldn't help it. He lay there, listening to the old boards creaking under the ceiling. One thought buzzed in his head. "They're just giving it away." The words spun around like wheels without a road. Clara didn't come out for breakfast. She didn't reach for her mug. She didn't say a word. It was as if she had locked herself in again, from the inside. He didn't knock. He just left some bread and honey. The plate remained untouched. In the afternoon, he went to the barn. It was cool there and smelled of mice. He sorted through the boards, looking for something to replace the rotten roof, but his thoughts kept wandering away from the nails to Clara's voice. Her quiet tone, unassuming, but final. It was as if he himself had been added to the list of those who remained silent. He sat down on a barrel and spoke aloud. To no one. Just to the air. So what am I supposed to do? Go beat up that idiot from the fair? Yell that I'm not like that? That's ridiculous. No one would believe me. And who am I to prove anything? Madame Laurent came by in the evening. No jam, but she had news. I heard you got into a fight with Eve at the fair. People say you threw yourself at him. Was it because of a girl? So what if it was? Daniel, you don't understand how it looks. She's not my family. She has problems. She's not just, well, you know. You're not going to be a father at 60. And why would you? He was silent for a long time. Then he said sharply, Are you going to become a human being at any age? She shuddered. She wanted to say something but left, slamming the gate behind her. He remained at the window. His wife's jacket was hanging on the same nail, only now did he feel its weight. Not the weight of memories, but of responsibility. At night, he heard Clara moving in her room again. Then he heard her groping in the dark, feeling her way to the door. He opened it first. I'm not running away, she said. I just can't sleep. Me neither, he breathed. She sat down on the threshold. He sat down beside her. They were silent. Am I bothering you? She finally asked. He smiled. It was a heavy smile, with a tired mouth. If you were bothering me, I would have asked you to leave a long time ago. Why didn't you? Because I'm not an idiot. And I'm not a jerk. She leaned forward, listening to the wind. I think I'm memorizing the smell here. Everything smells like dry bread and apples. And you? I smelled fear. It has a smell too, especially if you sit in it for a long time. He sat on the porch for a long time after she left. He looked up at the sky, where there were no stars left. They seemed to be hiding, like everything else in this life. Something ached in his chest, but it wasn't an illness. It was memory, and maybe his conscience. He realized that nothing had disappeared. Not her pain, not his cowardice, not the words he hadn't said. It was all still there. And now it was up to him to decide who he was in this story. A passerby, or the owner, a witness, or family. As always, the answer didn't come right away. Only the damp wind, the smell of earth, and the feeling that tomorrow he would have to choose. Between convenient and right. At dawn, he approached Clara's door again. He stood there for a moment. Then he knocked. Once. Quietly, as if he didn't want to wake even the silence itself. Clara, he said through the crack. Wake up. Let's go. She opened the door herself, in a shirt knitted for someone else's shoulders, barefoot. Her eyes were staring into space, as always, but her gaze was directed inward, deep inside. Where? To the city. She didn't ask why. She just nodded. She wasn't surprised by his decisions, only by the emptiness that followed them. He threw on his jacket. He threw some hay into the cart. He started the horse. As she climbed in, he held her by the elbow, gently, as if afraid she would crumble. She wasn't trembling, but she sat as if waiting for pain. Familiar, everyday pain. They rode for a long time. The wheels rattled over the stones. The wind blew under their collars. Clara was silent. So was he. Only once did he say, I don't know what will happen, but I'll try. Try what? To do the right thing, at least once. In the city, they found a building. It was old, with a peeling facade and a sign with faded letters. A social center. There were cues, the smell of other people's bodies and soap, and wary glances. He went in, looking straight ahead. Clara was beside him. Behind the counter was a woman with the expression of someone who had heard it all before, and was no longer surprised by anything. "I want to register a girl. She lives with me. She has no documents." "No one. But she's with me." "Who is she to you?" He fell silent. Then he said, "A person." The woman pursed her lips. "We don't register persons. We arrange guardianship, or adoption, or temporary placement. Who are you to her?" "No one, for now." "But I want to be." "A relative?" "No." "Then it's complicated." He clenched his teeth. "What if we return her? To those who gave her away?" "They refused. Officially. I have the papers." "So, she's nobody's?" "Formally, yes." "Then write it down. She's mine now." The woman sighed, wearily, as if this wasn't the first time she'd had this conversation, but it was the first time someone hadn't asked, "How much will you pay?" Or, "Can you change your mind?" On the way back, Clara asked, "Do you still want me to stay?" He nodded, but he knew she couldn't see him. "Yes." "I want you to, even if it's difficult." "Especially if it is." She turned her head toward the wind. Her face was calm, not joyful, not relieved. Just, for the first time, no fear. At home, he took off his jacket and hung it next to the old one. Then he took another nail and hammered it in next to it. He hung up Clara's little jacket. She stood nearby, listening to the hammer tapping dully on the wood. "Now you're here too." She didn't answer. She just touched the nail quietly, as if that was more important than any words. In the evening, they sat at the table. He ate. She picked at her bread, silently. And then suddenly, "What if they come back?" "Who?" "The ones who gave you away. They'll say, 'We've changed our minds.'" He looked at her. "Then I'll tell them what I didn't tell myself many years ago. It's too late." That night he slept peacefully, for the first time, as if, having taken a step, he had stood on solid ground, even if barefoot, even if in the dark. He was no longer a passerby. He had become someone. For someone. He appeared as usual, without knocking. One day, Daniel looked out into the yard and saw a boy crouching under the apple tree. He was about 12 years old. His jacket was too small, his boots too big. In his hands he held a carrot, clearly stolen from someone else's rabbit. "What do you want?" Daniel grumbled. "I'm just looking around. Did you take that girl? The blind one?" "None of your business." "I don't care. My uncle drinks and they took me too. But then they gave me back. So I knew it wasn't forever." He chewed the carrot like a cigar, confidently, brazenly, and lonely. "What's your name?" Clara asked, coming out barefoot. "Jules. What's yours?" "Clara. You really can't see. Really. Are you really stealing from rabbits?" He laughed. The first time, it was sincere. Then he held out a carrot to her. She didn't take it. She touched it, touched the boy's fingers. And she said, "Your hands are like those of someone who falls a lot." "Well, not everyone is lucky with their eyes," he replied. From then on, Jules started coming around. Not every day, but when he felt he couldn't go on any longer. He brought strange gifts, a bird's feather, an old coin, a nail carved into the shape of a little man. Clara listened. She didn't ask questions. She just stayed there, and suddenly she began to talk more. Once he asked, "What's it like to live in darkness?" She thought about it. "It's like living inside water. Sounds are muffled. people are like shadows, and sometimes it's scary that you'll miss something important because you can't see it. I'm afraid that I see everything but don't understand it. Then you're a little blind too. He fell silent. Then he smiled. But you're smart. That doesn't help, she replied. Through Jules, Clara learned that people in the village were still talking. Some thought Daniel had lost his mind. Others thought he was preparing for death. Why else would he bother with someone else's girl? What do you think? She asked the boy. I think you two are more real than the rest of the rabble. Why? Because you don't lie, even when you're silent. Once, Jules brought an old book about jumping horses. The cover was torn and some pages were missing, but he read aloud with such expression as if it were the Bible. Clara listened, laughed at the right places, pretended to be bored when the hero was a fool. And then she said, "Read it again. Only quietly. I'll memorize it." In the evening, Daniel approached Jules. "Listen, has anyone ever told you that you're clingy?" "Everyone. And you still stick around?" "Of course. If I listened to everyone, I'd have been under the fence a long time ago. But here it's quiet, and the milk is warm. You don't have a place to live?" "Sometimes. But it's not so bad. Well, if you need a place, there's a warm spot by the barn." "Thanks. But I'm just passing through, like the wind." Clara suddenly asked in the evening, "What if Jules wasn't here?" "It would be quieter. But worse." He nodded and thought, "That's strange. Sometimes you need someone who speaks without a filter, to hear yourself." Spring entered the house quietly, without fanfare. Just one morning, there was more light in the window. The floor was colder, and mice were scratching under the porch again. He led the mare out onto the fresh grass. Clara stood in the doorway and listened to the hooves pounding the ground. "She's tired," she said, "but not angry." "How do you know?" "Tired people breathe differently." He didn't argue. He just smiled. Again, Jules dragged an old stool over and began to repair it in the barn, without asking, without explanation. He just sat down, spat on his palm, and said, "It's a good one. Just needs a new leg." Clara stood nearby, listening to the sound of the hammer as if it were a drum in an orchestra. "Are you a good man?" she asked suddenly. "It depends on the day." "And today?" He paused, then muttered, "Today, I just don't want to be bad." Daniel began to take Clara to the vegetable garden. At first, just to let her smell the mint, then to teach her what grew where. She memorized it. With her hands, with her feet, with her sense of smell. "This is an onion," he said. "It stinks. And this is a radish. It's spicy. And this is a strawberry." She smiled. "It smells like childhood. Although maybe it's just your soap." He laughed quietly. In the attic, he found an old gramophone. He wiped it down, turned it, and it creaked and crackled. But then it started to play. Old waltzes, the kind that even the walls seemed to remember. "Shall we dance?" he asked Clara jokingly. "Only if you're not leading. I trust the floor more than I trust you." He wasn't offended. He was just happy that she could joke around. They ate together. Not always in silence. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they told stories. He told her how he once almost drowned in a well, how he stole a plum from his neighbor, how he loved to be silent, not because he didn't know any words, but because he didn't want to waste them on strangers. "I'm the opposite," Clara replied. "I talked non-stop my whole life until I realized that words aren't armor. They're a target." Sometimes they just sat on the porch, listening to the wind rustle the leaves, to the neighbor's dog barking. to the day passing slowly, like a boat without oars. "It's quiet here," said Clara. "It's deafening," he replied. "Silence isn't always good. I thought good meant when no one hits you. Sometimes silence hurts more than a blow. Jules once brought a homemade kite. He made it out of rags and sticks." Daniel smiled. "It won't fly." "If it does, will you take me in?" "Where are you going?" "Nowhere. I was just thinking. If there's a home for a girl with no eyes, maybe there's one for a boy with no purpose. We don't have an extra bed. And I don't have a spare future. So we're even." The snake flew. Not for long, not straight, but it flew nonetheless. Clara laughed, a real laugh. Daniel watched and thought that he had never heard such sounds before in his life. Only rain, animals, old music, and voices in his head. And now, the girl who had been given away with a horse was laughing. And he understood. Home is not walls. It is sound, laughter, warmth, even if it came to a dilapidated shed and sat on a bench with a missing leg. They put a second chair on the porch, old but sturdy, and Clara said, "This is for those who just want to be around." He nodded, without even asking who she was waiting for. He just knew. Now there was a place here not only for him, and in that, everything was new. Everything was right. Everything was scary. Because as soon as light appears in a house, the darkness begins to rage. The letter came unexpectedly, in a gray, thick envelope with angular letters on the back. No name, no warmth, just a dry address and, most importantly, his son's last name. The one Daniel hadn't heard out loud in many years. He printed it out in the shed, not at home, not with Clara, where it was easier not to react, where no one would see his hand tremble. The letter was short. No greeting. No, Dad. Just a demand. The farm will be sold. The documents are ready. You have until the end of the month to leave. We will take what belongs to the family. Don't do anything stupid. Signed. Abrupt. Cold. Like a scar. He sat down on a box of nails. His heart wasn't pounding. It just felt heavy. As if something old, but important, had been torn away. Not like a rope. Like a breath. He didn't think they would come. But they did. The very next day. His son was thin, wearing a jacket that didn't belong to him. His son's wife was the same woman who had kept her distance at his wife's funeral, as if afraid of being infected by simplicity. "We won't be long," she said, without looking at Daniel. "We just need the papers and the keys." "The farm is my home," he said quietly. "Home? It's an abandoned barn. We want to sell it while we can still get something for it." Clara came out of the kitchen, smoothly, barely touching the wall. His son's wife raised an eyebrow. "Who's that?" Her son looked at her, as if she were a speck of dust, as if she were a mistake on the shopping list. "Have you lost your mind? Did you bring a child home from the street?" "She's not from the street. She's with me." "Is she blind?" "Yes." "God." His son stepped closer. "Do you understand that if we sell, everything has to be cleared out?" And cleared out is not a metaphor. Daniel stood there. He didn't shout, but inside, something was cracking. He couldn't remember the last time he felt his shoulders rise, not from the wind, but from rage. "She's staying." "Then leave with her." He approached Clara. He took her by the shoulder. She wasn't trembling, but she was tense. She was like a string. "Everything is fine," he told her. "I'm home." "No," his son interrupted. "You were home, and now you're just a tenant with no rights." They left, but the air remained crumpled, like after a thunderstorm, not yet rain, but no longer sky. Clara sat on the porch, silent. "I don't want you to lose your home because of me," she said. "And I don't want to lose you because of the house," he replied. "But they're family. And you're real." He realized then that the line had been crossed, that to go back would be to betray her and himself. And for the first time in many years, he said aloud what he had usually kept hidden in his heart. "I no longer have a son. But I'm here, aren't I?" He looked at her. "Yes." And that was all he needed to hear. After his son left, there were no letters, no phone calls, only rumors. The neighbors whispered that the farm was almost sold, that Daniel was about to be evicted. Some said it out loud. "Poor old man. He's completely lost his mind. He gave everything to that girl, and now she's run away. Or worse." He heard everything, through closed doors, through half smiles at the market, through the kind advice of Madame Laurent, who had become a frequent visitor, like an inspector without a mandate. "I understand everything, Daniel. You're alone. It's hard for you. But think about how she'll feel when you're gone." "When I'm gone, I won't care anymore," he snapped. "But her?" He didn't answer, because he didn't know. Clara became quieter. She didn't cry, but she didn't laugh either. She did everything the same, neatly, precisely, from memory, but as if without passion. Sometimes she sat by the window and whispered to herself. First they gave her away. Then they took her back. Now they'll give her away again. Nothing ever changes. He heard her. He pretended not to hear. Jules began to visit less often. First his grandmother was ill. Then his mother had come to visit. And then he simply didn't explain. The last time he came, his lip was cut. "Who did that?" Daniel asked. "No one. A stranger. It doesn't matter. It's important. Everything that concerns you is important." Jules shrugged. Then he looked at Clara and said, "I thought it was quiet here, but there's a draft." "A draft isn't so bad," she replied quietly. "It's worse when the door is closed and the air is stale." He left. He said, "I'll be back." But he didn't come back. Not the next day. Not the day after that. One morning, Daniel woke up to complete silence. The mare wasn't neighing. The stove wasn't crackling. Clara wasn't moving. He got up. The kitchen was empty. The bed in the room was made. Her old shirt was on the chair. He ran to the garden, to the barn, to the lake. Nowhere. Only a footprint near the fence. Small. Barefoot. He understood. She had left. Alone. Blind. He found her only in the evening, in the bushes near the old mill. She was sitting under a tree. Her knees were drawn up to her chest. Her lips were pressed together. Her face was white, like milk. "I can't be the reason you get kicked out," she whispered. "I'm not a thing, but I'm not a person either, if everything falls apart because of me." He sat down next to her, slowly, without a word. "I don't want you to choose between me and your home. I've already chosen. Why? Because you're no less than home. You're more." They sat there until dark, without light, without explanation. Then he stood up, took her in his arms, like a child, like himself many years ago, when he also didn't know where to go. At home, she fell asleep immediately, without words, without fear. And he sat down by the window. He watched the shadows move in the darkness, and he felt that the war was still ahead, with the documents, with his son, with life. But worst of all, with himself, because inside him there was a voice. What if they're right? The letter arrived on the third day after Clara left for the mill. A thin envelope, thick paper, a lawyer's signature. Inside was a sentence, without a trial. In accordance with the previously signed agreement, the property is subject to expropriation. In the absence of voluntary eviction, the case will be referred to court. He read it twice, not because he didn't understand, but because he couldn't believe it. His son, decided everything without him. Passed sentence like an accountant, dry by the numbers, without hesitation. He sat down at the table. His hands lay on the wood, as if they were no longer good for anything. The tea had grown cold. Bread crumbs lay on the tablecloth like ashes. Clara was in the other room. It was quiet. She wasn't asleep. But she wasn't alive either. He could feel it. This was it. The moment when you don't know what to do, not because there are no options, but because there is no point. The neighbor came back. Without a word, she put a pot on the stove. Then she sat down opposite him. She stared, silently, for a minute, 2, and then she exhaled. "You lost." He didn't answer. "Did you think love would win? That the heart is more important than papers? No, Daniel. Papers win. Money wins. Family, even scoundrels, win. And you're left with a girl and a mare. Without rights, without protection." He was still silent. "I'm not gloating. You just have to understand. You have nowhere to go. Neither her nor you. And no one will help you. Do you understand?" He looked up. For the first time in a long time, his eyes were empty. "I understand." She left. He stayed. He sat down by the stove. He rested his forehead on his palm and just sat there. He didn't think. He didn't feel. He wasn't afraid. Just nothing. Clara came in half an hour later. He didn't hear her. "Did you get the letter?" He nodded. "And what?" "That's it." She came closer, sat down next to him, put her hand on his shoulder, gently, as if she was afraid of crushing it. "I'll leave. Then you won't have to choose." He didn't turn around. "It's too late." "Why?" "Because I've already chosen. And I lost." She didn't answer. She just laid her head on his shoulder. And they sat there like two people who had no one left to save. Later, he went out into the yard. He took a hammer. He walked over to the shed, and he began to break the shelf he had built 3 months ago. Quietly, methodically, as if he wanted to erase the traces. Not of anger, not of pain, but of meaning. Because if everything is falling apart, you might as well start with yourself. The boards creaked. Dust rose. Nails flew out. And he continued, until his hands gave out, until all that was left was a pile of wood, and the feeling that he too was now nothing but splinters. At night, he lay down on the floor, in the very room where he once lived with his wife. He stared at the ceiling, but saw something else. Her, Clara, himself, and how none of it made sense anymore. He didn't cry. Tears are for those who hope, and he no longer hoped. He woke up not to a sound, to silence, the kind of silence in which even mice hide. The ceiling was the same, with cobwebs in the corner and a crack shaped like lightning. He stared at it for hours, silent, unmoving. Somewhere in another room, Clara rustled quietly, carefully, as if afraid of waking not him, but what might wake inside him. He didn't call out. He didn't go out. Everything inside was dead, not sick, dead, as if someone had turned off not the light, but the electricity in his heart. He remembered his wife, How she once went out on the porch in winter and said, "We need someone, anyone." He dismissed her then. "We have a cow." "That's not someone, Daniel. That's just something." And then she died. And since then, no one had mentioned someone again. He remembered how his son had left, far away, angry, with his lips pressed tightly together. "You never once said you were proud of me. What for? That's all." He wasn't a bad father. He was just empty. He didn't know how. He couldn't. No one taught him. He himself was beaten with a belt, then with silence. And then they just left him, like a box labeled unnecessary. He sat down, slowly, like an old man who's afraid that even the air could break his bones. "I'm tired," he said aloud. "I've been going in the wrong direction all my life. Always. My whole life." Clara stood in the doorway, short, wearing a shirt that came down to her knees. Her face was calm. "I heard you," she said quietly. "Everything you think I hear. Even when you're silent." He looked up. "And what do you hear?" "That you're afraid of losing the farm, and losing the right to be needed." He didn't answer. Then they went out onto the porch. They sat down next to each other. He poured her some milk. For himself, just water. They were silent for a long time. Then he said, "I've been afraid my whole life, of speaking, of living, of crying, of loving. I was afraid of not being the right person. And in the end, I became a nobody." She nodded. "I was afraid too, but not of that. I was afraid that if someone saw me, they would turn away, because I have no eyes, no future, no meaning. But you stayed, and you took me in." He looked at her, and suddenly realized that in all this time, he had never thanked her, not for a single word, not for the silence, not for simply being there. "You know, Clara," he breathed, "maybe we're not mistakes. Maybe we're just people who weren't seen." She took his hand, gently, carefully. "But we're here." He exhaled, and maybe that's enough. And it wasn't a heroic gesture. It wasn't a resolution. It was just the first honest thought he had ever spoken aloud. The next morning, he didn't stay silent. He woke Clara up earlier than usual, set a cup of warm milk in front of her, and said, "I'm leaving today. Alone. I don't know when I'll be back, but don't be afraid. You're safe here." She didn't ask any questions. She just nodded. He didn't explain where he was going, because explaining meant justifying himself, and he didn't have the strength to do that anymore. He just took his documents, tore a clean sheet of paper from an old notebook, and wrote, "I'm not asking, I'm stating. I'm not a thing that can be thrown away. And she's not a temporary obstacle. If you want to kick me out, do it out loud. Not through papers with more ink than love." He put the letter in his pocket and left. The city greeted him the same way it had many years ago, indifferently. The same signs, the same footsteps on the asphalt, the same oppressive grayness at the entrance to the notary's office. He went in, without an appointment, without a tie. The secretary looked at him suspiciously. "Who are you?" "I'm his father. But I'm no longer your client." The lawyer came out quickly. His son hadn't come. Only a power of attorney. Only an order. Daniel put the paper on the table. "You can sell the farm, but on one condition. Everything on it is mine. Every last nail. Every last soul." "That's not quite true." "Then we'll see you in court." "You'll lose." "You've already lost. All that's left is to say it nicely." He turned and left. At home, Clara met him silently. He sat down next to her. He smelled of dust, then of the street. He didn't wash. He didn't take off his jacket. He just said, "I don't know what will happen, but now I'm not silent." She nodded. "This is home now." In the evening, he took an old photograph off the wall. It was of him, his wife, and his son when he was still a child. Everything was sepia-toned. They looked alive, but even then, they seemed to be apart. He wiped the frame and carefully removed the glass. He put the photo in a drawer. He hung a new one on the wall, Clara with a mare. She was stroking it. Next to her was Jules, making a funny face. He was standing behind them, a little to the side, but still close. He hung it up and thought, "Now, I know where to start. Not with shouting, not with reproaches, with presence, with choice, with himself." His son arrived suddenly, without warning, with papers, lawyers, and an indifferent look that tried to hide his pain. "You're putting on a show," he said. "This isn't your war." "It's my life," Daniel replied, "and your absence is part of that show." His son fell silent. A heavy atmosphere hung in the room. Clara stood silently in the corner. "You know," his father continued, "I'm not perfect. I wasn't a good husband or a good father, but I always tried to be honest with myself." "Honest?" his son sneered. "You kept quiet. You left. You hid. Yes, I was afraid of losing you, and I lost myself." He walked over to Clara. "She is my family. If you don't like it, leave." His son looked at her. A flash of unexpected pain crossed his eyes. "I didn't come here to argue. I came to understand." They were silent. Night spread through the house like a dark river, and then something happened that no one expected. The son sat down next to her. He put his hand on the table. "Tell me everything. Not as a father, but as a man." Clara smiled for the first time in a long time, and Daniel realized that it didn't matter who had been where or who had lost what. What mattered was who was here and now. The morning in the house was different. Light filtered through the curtains, falling softly on the wooden table. His wife's jacket was still hanging on the nail, but now next to it was Clara's light blouse. Daniel stood by the window. In his hands was the letter that had once caused him fear, but now it was just a piece of paper. He was in no hurry to open it. There was no need. Clara was smoothly combing the mare in the yard. Jules stood nearby, clutching a piece of chalk in his hands, ready to draw something on the ground. "Careful, there's a step," he heard a voice say. He smiled, truly for the first time. He turned slowly, and a slight smile played on his face. "I know," he replied quietly. The silence in the house was not empty. It was peace, dignity, life going on. He took the letter, put it on the table, sat down, and looked out the window. All this journey, from pain and silence, had brought him here. To what it means to be close, to be needed, to be home. Write in the comments how you think a person can change their destiny, even when the whole world is against them. Share your stories about how love and support have helped you overcome difficulties. Your experience is important, and together we can inspire each other to new deeds.